Let's bring in Bill English. He's Finance Minister of New Zealand. He joins us from Singapore, where he's on a budget road trip to Asia. So 4% a year, is that what you're suggesting at the moment for the next 4 years? And are you confident you can hold on to that?
Well, it'll rise to 4%. This next year will be somewhere around 2% mark. But what underpins that is the highest export prices we've had in many years. And also the rebuild of Christchurch, which was badly affected by an earthquake, is going to bring some very significant inflows, creating jobs in New Zealand.
Bill English, what's the purpose of your trip there to this part of the world now?
Well, a couple of reasons. We've been borrowing fairly extensively in the sovereign market over the last couple of years, particularly this last year. And we've been pleased to see growing investor interest in the New Zealand bond market. It's now reached about 50 billion. It's become quite liquid, and we're getting some very good pricing, and we want to continue that relationship with investors who've had a positive experience. And we're also getting a sense of the opportunities across the Asia Pacific. We are hooked to the China-Australia train. We benefit from strong growth in Australia as well as in China and across the Asia Pacific. And we want to get a much better grip on the dynamism here so that we can continue our big export push to rebalance our own economy and take opportunities here.
Yeah, I'll come to the train analogy that you made just now in a second, but I want to talk to you about the sovereign rating, AA plus here, negative outlook at Standard & Poor's. They're a bit concerned about this external debt that you do have. How do you respond to them?
Well, we've had some of the same concerns as the ratings agencies. A big driver of our external debt has been the private sector. Over the last 4 or 5 years, a housing boom, very similar to other developed countries. But New Zealanders have got the message. They've stopped borrowing. Actually, they're starting to drop the private sector debt as a proportion of GDP. Now the government is following along by getting its own finances in order. So we're looking at a track to surplus by 2014 and a substantial reduction in the government's borrowing requirements. We think that the markets are responding positively to that, and it's likely the ratings agencies will be able to respond positively to it too.
Right, well, the current account deficit is forecast to widen to 7% of GDP. You know, what can the government do to narrow that?
Well, we've been having a strong focus on getting a shift in emphasis in our economy from borrowing, which is financed offshore, through to lifting our national savings. And some of those forecasts of going back to 7%, in my view, are a bit pessimistic. We're seeing quite a shift in New Zealand household and consumer behaviour, and I think that's likely to become a structural shift. And in this last budget, we took further measures to lift our national savings, and that's been pretty well received, and I think it's likely to show benefits in an improved external balance over the next few years.
Are you really at the moment, well, how do you feel about the strength of the New Zealand dollar right now? What's your view on that?
Well, it's a fully floating currency, so in some ways the government's views are no more relevant than anyone else's. It has been a bit higher than we expected. Traditionally, New Zealand coming out of a recession has a drop in its currency. This time, though, it's held up pretty strongly against most currencies, except perhaps the Australian dollar, where we have become very competitive because of a low exchange rate in our biggest single market. So it's a bit of a headwind as we try to rebalance our economy, but I must say the New Zealand export sector has shown remarkable resilience, and despite the highest 5-year average against the US dollar in the last 60 years, they are continuing to get the benefits of higher prices in the markets and continuing to grow. So it's a bit of a headwind. We can manage it. We had expected it to be lower, but clearly there's a different view out there in the market.
Okay, just you mentioned about this that you're on a carriage on the AustraliaChina train. I'm going to continue the analogy and ask you what happens if it derails.
Well, of course that's a bit of a risk, and it's one of the reasons why we need to make sure we diversify our growth across the Asia-Pacific area, at the same time as maintaining some quite high-value export markets in Europe and the UK. So the balance is shifting more to the Asia-Pacific area. but we're diversifying our own export base and diversifying the destinations. We also think that because our story is more about food and protein, while Australia's is about resources, that the structural demand for food across Asia Pacific is reasonably solid. And while we don't expect the current high prices to remain, it's likely that they'll be fairly solid for the next few years.
Bill English, thanks so much for your time. Bill English is the Deputy Prime Minister and the Finance Minister there of New Zealand, just talking to us about the prospects for the economy.